The knife did not move. That was the thing the narrator remembers most clearly. Not the smell of cold stone and salted cream that filled the storage room, not the pale October light pressing through the single high window, not even the butter itself, sitting on its wooden board like something carved from a quieter world. It was the stillness of the man holding the knife. He was not a man accustomed to stillness. He wore a city coat and city impatience, and he had ridden 3 days from Denver with his associate expressly to deliver bad news and profit from it. And yet there he stood, a small curl of golden butter balanced on the tip of his blade, and he did not move, and he did not speak, and the cold air between the four of them held something that none of them quite had a word for. His associate stood slightly behind him, one hand braced against the stone shelf, also silent. The rancher watched them both, and in the doorway, her stained apron still wrapped around her waist, her cloth sack sitting on the floor beside her boot. She watched too, and her expression was quiet and patient and entirely without surprise. But that is where the story ends, and this is where the story begins. 5 days earlier, the road that ran along the river valley floor was soft with October mud, and a young woman was walking it alone. She carried a cloth sack over one shoulder. It was not heavy, there was not much in it. A change of dress, a small wrapped bundle that clinked softly when she moved, though she held it steady by instinct. She walked with her chin level and her eyes forward, the way a person walks when they have learned that looking uncertain costs more than it saves. The advertisement had been pinned to the board outside the dry goods store in town. She had read it twice, which was once more than it deserved. Help wanted. Dairy work, sweeping and scrubbing only. Wages modest. Inquire at the Carver Dairy Ranch, River Road North. Sweeping, scrubbing, she had done both since she was old enough to hold a broom, and she had done far more than both, but the advertisement did not ask for that, and she had learned not to offer more than was requested until she understood the room she was walking into. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road. A low house, a long dairy barn, fencing that had seen better years, a yard where the mud was churned deep and dark from the passage of cattle. It was not a prosperous place. She could see that plainly. She had grown up on a place not unlike it, and she recognized the particular exhaustion that a failing farm wears, the way it shows in unpainted boards and gates hung crooked and silence where there ought to be noise. She stopped at the gate. She looked at the barn. She shifted the cloth sack on her shoulder, and she felt the small bundle inside settle against her hip, the carved wooden mold her grandmother had pressed into her hands the winter before she died, and then she opened the gate and walked in. He was standing in the dairy barn when she came through the yard. She could see him through the open double doors, a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that is not peace, but rather a man holding himself very carefully together. He stood among the churns and the wooden shelving with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he was looking at something on the floor with an expression she had seen before on men who had run out of options and had not yet decided whether to be angry or defeated. The something on the floor was 12 buckets. She paused in the doorway without announcing herself, and she counted them. She could not help it. It was the way her mind worked. 12 wooden buckets lined in 2 rows, each one covered with a cloth weighted at the corners, each one holding, she suspected by the particular sourness already threading through the cool autumn air, cream that had turned. 12 buckets. She understood, without being told, what that meant to a dairy ranch. He heard her step on the threshold and turned, and she saw his face properly for the first time, weathered in the way that Montana weathers men, older than his years in the eyes, and carrying behind the coldness something that looked very much like shame, though he wore it as pride, because he had learned long ago that pride is easier to stand upright in. He looked at her the way men of his sort looked at hired help, the brief assessing glance, the almost immediate dismissal, the return of attention to what he considered the actual problem in the room. "You answered the advertisement," he said. "Not a question." "I did," she said. He moved past her and took a broom from the wall beside the door and held it out to her. "Floor needs clearing," he said. "Churns want scrubbing when you're through. There's a bucket of hot water around the side. Don't disturb what's on the shelving." She took the broom. He did not ask her name. He returned to his position near the 12 buckets and stood there again in that careful, coiled stillness, and she began to sweep. The barn was not filthy. It was the barn of a man who believed in order, she could see that, but it had the dusty neglect of a place where one person had been doing the work of 3 for too long, and the floor was tracked and gritty, and the corners were beginning to grow dim with cobwebs. She swept. She did not speak. She did not offer her name either, because he had not asked for it, and she had learned that silence in a new place teaches you more than speaking does. He moved once, to lift a corner of one of the cloths and look at the cream beneath, and the expression that crossed his face in that unguarded moment was not anger. It was grief. She looked away before he could notice that she had seen it, and she swept steadily toward the far wall. She swept for a long while without looking at him directly. That was a skill in itself, the ability to take in a room without appearing to examine it. She had learned it early, in kitchens and farmhouses where attention was not always welcome, where the hired woman was expected to be present, but not perceptive. She had learned to see everything from the corners of her eyes, to hold what she observed quietly inside herself, and to let it settle there like sediment until it told her something useful. What she saw told her quite a lot. The dairy was well built. The walls were tight, the ventilation thoughtful, the shelving solid and level. Someone had chosen the dimensions carefully, had understood that a working dairy needed cold air moving low and warm light moving high, and had built accordingly. That someone had known what they were doing and had cared. The neglect was recent. The abandonment of pride was recent. The man himself was recent, in the way that grief is always recent, always sitting just at the surface of a person no matter how long it has technically been. She swept the corners clean. She carried the grit out through the side door in a long, even motion and left no trail behind her. Then she returned to the churns. The churns were copper, old but good quality, and they had gone unscrubbable for longer than was ideal. She filled a basin from the hot water pail and set to work without being told how, her movements efficient and unhurried, and the sound of the scrub brush against copper was the only sound in the dairy for a long while, beyond the occasional shift of his boots against the floor. At some point, she worked her way along the wall toward the shelving where the 12 buckets stood in their careful row. She did not intend anything by it. She was cleaning the floor below the shelf, working the brush into the planking in slow circles, and the proximity was simply proximity. But the smell reached her before she expected it, that sharp, gone smell of cream that has crossed past the edge of what most people could save, the smell that meant work, rather than waste, to the particular kind of person who knew the difference. She set the brush aside. She lifted one lid, not quickly, not with ceremony. She simply lifted it and leaned close, and breathed in once, with the focused attention of someone taking a reading. She set it back. The expression she wore in that moment was not what he expected. He was watching, she had known he was watching, and she had made no effort to conceal her face, because she had nothing to conceal. What she felt plainly. It was not disgust. It was not pity. It was the look of a person encountering a problem they already know how to solve, turning it once in their mind to confirm the shape of it, and finding that the shape matches. She picked up her brush again. He said nothing, but across the cold room, something in his stillness changed. Barely, quietly, the way ice changes just before it begins to give. She worked through the afternoon without speaking. He found reasons to stay near. A hinge that needed checking on the far stall door, a length of rope that wanted coiling, a water trough that had somehow required his attention 3 separate times in the span of 2 hours. He was not a man accustomed to watching himself invent reasons to be somewhere, and the recognition of it sat uncomfortably in his chest, the way a splinter sits before you know quite where to look for it. She noticed. She said nothing. The dairy floor, by the time the light began its amber slide toward evening, was cleaner than it had been in the better part of a year. The churns stood in their row like soldiers recalled to duty. She had scrubbed the paddles, hung the cloths, swept the corners where old cream had dried to a pale crust along the baseboard. She had done the work she had been paid to do, and she had done it without complaint and without conversation, and he was aware, in the particular uncomfortable way of a man whose assumptions are beginning to lose their footing, that he owed her more credit than he had budgeted for her. The sun was behind the ridge when she straightened, pressed one hand briefly to the small of her back, and set her brush across the top of the nearest churn. She turned and looked at the 12 buckets lined along the far wall with their lids sealed against the cold air. She looked at them the way she had looked at the one she had opened, steadily, without sentiment. He was near the door. He had told himself he was leaving. "What do you mean to do with the cream?" she asked. The question was quiet. It was not an accusation, it was not a suggestion wearing the clothes of a question. It was simply a question, careful and direct, the kind that a person asks when they already understand the answer may matter more than the one being asked knows yet. He looked at the buckets. He had been looking at them for 3 days with the flat gaze of a man who has already made his peace with a loss. "Pour it out," he said. "Come morning." She nodded once. Not in agreement, not in argument, simply the nod of a person receiving information they will now consider privately, on their own time, in their own way. He waited, without meaning to wait, for something more. A protest, a question, an offer of some kind, from this woman who had spent the last several hours proving she was not quite what he had taken her for. She gave him none of it. She simply picked up her cloth sack from the corner where she had left it, slung it over one arm, and thanked him quietly for the day's wages. He went inside. He banked the fire, turned down the lamp in the main room, and was asleep before the cold had fully settled into the rafters. The dairy lantern, which she had borrowed without asking, burned on. The lantern was still burning when he came out at first light. He saw it from the house, that warm, stubborn glow pressing through the gaps in the dairy house planking, and he stopped on the porch step with one boot half laced, the cold morning air sitting on his shoulders like a judgment. He knew, before he crossed the yard, before he lifted the latch and pushed the door open and let the smell of cream and effort and something faintly sharp roll out to meet him, that she had not left. He had told her to pour it out. She was at the churn. Her back was to him, her sleeves rolled, her cloth sack hanging on the same nail where the bridles usually hung, and on the work table, set with a precision that was almost ceremonial, sat the wooden mold. Even in the thin, early light he could see the thistle carved into its face, pressed clean, ready. Beside it, the first bucket, already worked, already changed into something that was no longer what he had given up on. He stood in the doorway and felt the cold he had brought in from outside do battle with the warmth she had built in there through the night. "You didn't pour it out," he said. She turned then, unhurried, the way a person turns when they have been expecting a conversation and have already decided, in advance, that they will not be frightened by it. "No," she said. That was all. One word, level as a floorboard, with nothing beneath it that invited negotiation on that particular point. The fury came up in him the way it always did, fast, and from somewhere close to the thing he protected most fiercely, which was not his money or his land, but his right to decide what was already finished. She had reached into his finished things and refused them. She had spent the night with his 12 buckets of ruin and his borrowed lantern, without his leave, without a word of warning, and had begun without him. "That was my stock," he said, "my ruined stock. I gave you a direction." "You did," she agreed. She did not apologize. She did not flinch or soften the admission with any flutter of explanation. She simply looked at him, steadily, openly, with that particular quality of attention that made a man feel he was being read more carefully than he was reading. Then she said, "I would like until the buyers arrive to show you something." He opened his mouth. He could not have said afterward what he intended to say, because whatever it was, dissolved before it reached the air. It was not her words that stopped him. It was the composure behind them, that extraordinary, unhurried composure, the kind that belongs to someone who has carried heavy things a long time without setting them down in anyone else's path. He looked at the mold. He looked at the bucket. He looked at her. The cold morning waited outside. The buyers were 2 days away, and the dairy lantern, finally finished with its long night's work, went quietly out. He told himself he was checking on the churns. That was the first reason he gave himself, around mid-morning, when he appeared in the dairy doorway and stood with his arms folded and his expression arranged into something that could pass, at a fair distance, for indifference. The churns needed inspection, he reasoned. A man had a right to inspect his own churns. She did not look up. She was working at the long wooden table, her sleeves pushed to the elbows, her movements deliberate and unhurried as river water, the kind of current that looks slow until you watch what it does to stone. The cream she had drawn from the first bucket sat in the churn before her, already thickened, already changed into something that had no business being what it was, given where it had started. She pressed the salt in layers, shallow and careful, the way a person lays pages in a book they intend to read again. Not once did she rush the motion. Not once did she seem aware of being watched. He checked the churns. Then he stood in the doorway a little longer than checking required. By noon he was inside the dairy entirely, though he had found a beam to lean against and a posture that suggested he had stopped for some other purpose and simply had not yet recalled what it was. The smell had begun to change. That was what held him, not sentiment, not curiosity, not any softer feeling he would have been unwilling to admit to. It was the smell. Something was rising out of those 12 condemned buckets that had no right to rise, something warm and deep and faintly sweet beneath the salt, the kind of scent that pulls at a person below the level of thought, the way wood smoke does, or rain before it arrives on a dry field. He did not say so. He shifted his weight against the beam and looked elsewhere when she glanced toward the window for light. He occupied himself with a hinge on the side door that had never given him any particular trouble. In the afternoon, he brought in wood for the small iron stove she had asked to use for warming the molds. He set it down. He left. He came back with more wood than was strictly needed and arranged it with the slow care of a man who has not yet invented a reason to depart. She said nothing. She did not thank him with words. But there was something in the stillness around her that acknowledged the wood, the way a quiet room acknowledges a door gently closed, and he felt it, and said nothing in return. By the time the low autumn light was dragging itself golden and reluctant across the dairy floor, he had stopped moving altogether. He was simply standing, watching. The mold sat waiting on the table's edge, its carved thistle dark with age and use, as patient as she was. He looked at the cream. He looked at the mold. He had not found a reason to leave in 3 hours. It was on the 3rd day that she spoke. Not much, not the kind of speaking that fills a room and expects to be remembered. But enough, and in that dairy, with the cold pressing itself flat against the window glass and the stove ticking quietly in the corner, enough was considerable. She had been working the salt into the second pressing, her hands moving in the slow, layered rhythm that looked almost meditative from across the room, when she said, without turning her head, "My grandmother called it listening to the cream." He had been standing near the far wall, in that particular posture he had adopted over the past 2 days, present without admitting it, watching without confessing to the watching. He did not move. He waited. She pressed the flat of her palm against the surface and held it there for a moment before she continued. "Sour cream is not ruined cream," she said. "It is cream that has already done some of the work for you. In cold air, mountain cold, valley cold like this, it holds together better through the churn than fresh. It takes the salt differently. You have to give it time, and you have to give it stages. Press the salt once and it sits on top. Press it twice and it begins to listen. Press it a third time and it becomes part of the thing itself." She paused, lifted her palm, examined what was there. "My grandmother taught me that on the eastern slope of a pass I have not seen in 7 years. She said the butter she made in bad cream seasons was always the butter people asked for by name." He had no idea when he had crossed the room. He was aware, distantly, of having moved, because the detail of the mold was now closer to him than it had been. The carved thistle, the worn edges of the wood, the faint ghost of a maker's mark on the underside. He could see the cream in the bowl, and the pale, specific color it had taken on, which was not quite white, and not quite gold, but something held between the two. "She is gone?" he asked. The question was quiet. He was not asking for conversation. He was asking the way a man asks when he already understands the answer and only wants to confirm that understanding. "Some years now," she said. He nodded. He did not say he was sorry. Something in the plainness of her voice made sympathy feel like an insult, and he was perceptive enough, barely, but enough, to sense that. The mold was hers? She carved it herself. Thistle, because her people came from a cold country, and she said, "Cold countries understand butter." There was a pause then that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of pause that settles between two people when something real has been said, and neither wants to cover it over too quickly with words. He looked at the mold a long moment. "She was right about the cold," he said at last, and she glanced up at him, just briefly, and almost smiled. The night came early in that valley, the way autumn nights do in Montana. Not gradually, but decisively, as if the mountains themselves had drawn a curtain. The ranch went quiet, the horses settled. The lamp in the bunkhouse dimmed, and he walked into the dairy alone. He did not bring a lantern at first. He stood in the doorway a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the blue-gray dark, and then he struck a match and touched it to the small oil lamp on the shelf near the door. The light spread slowly, amber and unsteady, across the long wooden work table where she had spent the day, across the scrubbed churns, pale and clean, across the cloth she had folded neatly and left at the edge of the table, as if order were a habit she had carried so long she performed it without thinking. And across the 6 blocks, they sat in a row along the cold end of the table, each one wrapped in a thin cloth, each one pressed with the thistle. He walked toward them the way a man walks toward something he does not entirely understand, slowly, with a kind of reluctant attention. He picked up the one nearest him and held it in both hands. It was cold, solid, heavier than he expected, though he had no real reason to be surprised by its weight. He stood there, holding it for a long time. The narrator will tell you something now that he would not have told you himself. He was not a man who spoke about the years before. He had learned, as men who have been wounded in quiet ways often do, that silence is a form of protection, not for himself alone, but for the wound itself, which he had come to treat almost tenderly, the way one treats an old injury that aches in certain weather. He did not want it touched. He did not want it explained, or understood, or resolved. He wanted it left where he had put it, behind the work, behind the early mornings, behind the particular loneliness of a man who runs a ranch alone and tells himself that is simply how it is. She had left in the second autumn. Not cruelly, not even angrily. She had left the way water leaves a cracked vessel, not all at once, but steadily, and then completely, until one morning he woke and understood that what remained in the house was only the shape of a life, not the life itself. She had said, this place felt like a door that would not open. He had not known how to answer that, and his silence had been, he understood now, its own kind of answer. After that, he had built the walls higher, not with intention, with habit. He had kept everything out, cold out, company out, the particular mercy of being known by another person, out. He looked down at the block of butter in his hands, at the small carved thistle pressed into its surface, clear and deliberate as a signature. Something in his chest moved, cautiously, like a thing testing whether the door might open after all. They came early, which was its own kind of insult. The wagon rolled into the yard before the morning frost had lifted from the fence rails, before the light had fully settled into the valley, as though time on this ranch was no longer something the rancher controlled, as though they were already taking inventory. There were two of them, the same two who had ridden out 3 weeks prior with their leather ledgers and their careful, courteous contempt. They stepped down from the wagon with the particular ease of men who had already decided the outcome of the day. One wore a coat that cost more than a season of milk sales. The other carried a folded document in his breast pocket, and he touched it once as he crossed the yard, the way a man touches a deed he considers his own. The rancher met them at the door. He was tense in the shoulders, and she could see it from where she stood near the cold room, could see the way his jaw had set and his hands had gone still at his sides, the posture of a man preparing to receive something he could not stop. They shook hands without warmth. The one with the document said something about the note, about the terms, about the patience of the company, and the word, patience, landed in the yard like a stone dropped into shallow water. They were not patient men. They were men who had learned to dress impatience in polite language. She turned back to the cold room. The blocks were arranged on the long wooden shelf in 2 rows of 6, each one pale gold in the cold air, each one pressed through the thistle mold so that the carved flower sat clean and deliberate on every surface. 24 pounds, the work of 4 days and 12 ruined buckets, and every careful hour between. She did not call for anyone to come see. She simply set the last block into its place, straightened the cloth beneath them, and stepped back. Then she stood in the doorway of the cold room with her hands at her sides and waited, the way a woman waits who has nothing to prove and everything done. Inside the house, one of the buyers was already speaking in lowered tones about the land deed, about the river access, about the eastern boundary line. His voice carried the pleasant efficiency of a man dividing something that does not yet legally belong to him. The rancher's responses came shorter, quieter. The old pride was still there. She could hear it in the pauses, but it was thinning, the way ice thins before it breaks. She looked at the 12 blocks of golden butter in the cold room and said nothing. She only waited. She heard the door of the ranch house open before she heard footsteps. Then the buyers came into the yard, the way men come when they believe they are doing someone a courtesy, slowly, with their hands in their coat pockets, wearing the mild expressions of people who have already made their decision and are only completing a formality. One of them carried a small folding knife. The other had a handkerchief pressed to his collar against the cold. The rancher followed a half-step behind, saying nothing, his jaw set in the particular way of a man bracing for impact he cannot stop. She stepped aside from the cold room doorway without being asked. The first buyer looked at the rows of pale gold blocks and made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal, but something close to both. He unfolded his knife with the ease of a man who has tasted 100 batches of inferior product and expects this to be the 101st. He cut through the nearest block at its center. The butter did not crumble. It held its edge like good wood holds a true cut, clean and close-grained, the interior pale gold shading toward deeper amber at the pressed surface. The thistle flower split neatly down its carved heart. He lifted a piece on the flat of his blade, looked at it the way men look at things they are about to dismiss, and then placed it on his tongue. He went still, not the stillness of a man thinking, The stillness of a man who has been interrupted by something he did not expect, stopped mid-motion, the way a clock stops, between one tick and the next. The second buyer reached past him without waiting for an invitation. He used the corner of the block, cut his own piece smaller, and tasted it with the practiced neutrality of a man who prices things for a living. He did not move for longer. The cold room held the silence like a held breath. The river moved somewhere below the yard, low and steady under its autumn ice. A bird crossed the high window above the shelves and was gone. This was the moment the story had been circling toward since it began, the moment she had stood in that same doorway tasting nothing, knowing everything, while the buyers were still inside speaking pleasantly about river access and boundary lines and the uncomplicated arithmetic of a ruined man's debt. Now they stood in the cold room with butter on their tongues and said nothing at all. And the rancher, who had hired her to sweep floors, who had handed her a broom like an apology for not being able to offer more, looked at her across the rows of golden blocks with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. He looked uncertain. He looked awake. The first buyer set his small knife down on the edge of the table. He did not look at his partner. He did not look at the rancher. He studied the remaining blocks with the careful attention of a man revising an equation he had already considered solved. "What quantity," he said at last, "could you supply per month?" It was not quite a question. It landed in the cold room, like a stone dropped into still water, and the circles it made were slow and wide. The rancher opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked once at her, standing at the far end of the table, her stained apron still tied at her waist, her hands quiet at her sides, and something passed between them that neither of them named. "Tell them," she said, quietly, simply, the way she said most things. He named a number. The second buyer wrote it down without being asked. The negotiation that followed was not long. These were men who priced things for a living, and knew when a number had already declared itself. She watched them from her place at the end of the table, and did not move, and did not speak again. She had said what needed saying in the cold room before any of them arrived, and everything since then had been the world catching up to what the butter already knew. The figure they offered cleared the promissory note with enough remainder to cover the month ahead. The rancher signed the paper on the dairy table, in the room that still smelled of salt and cream, using the pen the first buyer produced from his coat pocket, with a formality that felt almost, in that moment, like apology. They left without ceremony. The creak of the wagon, the sound of hooves on the frost-hardened yard, and then the valley resumed its ordinary silence, the river below, the wind across the grass, the cold and particular quiet of a Montana morning that has finished deciding something. He stood alone in the cold room. The 12 blocks sat on the table before him, golden, patient, still carrying the impression of the thistle mold along their surfaces, the small carved flower pressed into every one of them like a signature, or a blessing, or both. He had walked into this week a man preparing to lose everything he had built and endured, and refused to abandon, even when abandonment would have been easier. He had hired a woman to sweep his floors. He had handed her a broom. She had handed him back his ranch. He did not move for a long time. The cold room held him the way it had held the buyer's silence earlier, completely, without comment, without mercy or comfort, just the truth of a thing, present and undeniable. He had already surrendered this place in his mind. She had not let him. He found her in the corner of the dairy, near the side door, kneeling beside her cloth sack with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who has packed and unpacked the same few things so many times that the act requires no thought at all. The thistle mold was in her hands. She wrapped it slowly in its cloth, the way a person wraps something they intend to keep safe through whatever comes next, and settled it into the sack with a quiet precision that told him everything about who she was and how long she had been moving through a world that never asked her to stay. He stood in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She finished the knot at the sack's neck, smoothed the cloth with her palm, and then she looked at him. He had prepared words. He had stood in the cold room and assembled them carefully, the way a man assembles a thing he is not certain he knows how to build. But standing here, watching her prepare to leave with the same quiet competence with which she had arrived, the words rearranged themselves. He did not thank her. He did not apologize again. He did not ask her to stay, as though it were a favor she might grant him. He told her what the ranch was, what it had been, what it still could be if someone with her knowledge worked beside him, not for him, not beneath him, but alongside him, equal voice in the dairy's direction, equal share of what it earned, a room in the house that was hers, a place at the table that was hers, a stake in the land that was hers indeed if she chose it. He said it plainly, the way the West taught a man to say hard things, without ornament, without the false comfort of softening what you mean. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved outside. The river ran somewhere below the valley. The cold morning pressed its light through the one small window and lay it, pale and honest, across the dairy floor between them. She looked at him the way she had looked at that first bucket of sour cream, not with doubt, not with certainty, but with the calm, measuring attention of someone who knows the difference between what a thing appears to be and what it actually is. Then she set the sack down, not with resignation, not with relief, with the particular deliberateness of a woman making a choice that belongs entirely to herself. She had built a life out of moving forward. She stayed, this time, because staying felt like moving forward still, because he had made room, not for a housekeeper, not for hired hands, for her. The thistle mold remained wrapped in its cloth. It was not going anywhere, neither was she,